So I am going to share my screen because I have a little presentation here. And just for access during the presentation, I will be uh, describing any images that are present on the screen, as well as what's written on the presentation slides. Okay, so welcome everybody to uh, this presentation. What I'll be talking about today is curating access and disability arts. My name as well as my contact information is here. Please feel free to follow up after this presentation if you have any questions or you have any comments or you'd like to discuss anything that I've spoken about today. As well, Kristina and I will be returning for a second session next week, next Thursday, which will be a bit more of a drop-in working session. If you have any questions, if you have any if you'd like some assistance with perhaps implementing some of the things that we spoke about in today's presentation, or if you just want to kind of return and ask any questions that you might have generally about Tangled as an organization, the work that we do, or anything at all, really. So, as I was saying, we're going to start with thinking about some of the histories, the way that disability has been represented, and the ableism that disabled folks have kind of faced systemically in the context of the larger kind of arts and culture sector. I want to start with thinking about just a brief history of disability representation. And there's an image here, a screenshot from the movie Freaks, which was first presented in 1932. It's a screenshot from a film. It's black and white, and there's three people that are visibly disabled, kind of in circus or kind of like circus garb, looking towards the camera, and in the background you can sort of see like circus animals and a tent and some lights. And what it says on the screen is a brief history of disability representation. So I want to start with what Rosemary Garland Thompson has said before, which is that the history of disabled people in the Western world is in part the history of being on display, of being visually conspicuous while politically and socially erased. And I think this ties back to this idea of what's being presented in films like Freaks, because it's disability representation, but it's largely something that's been dictated from the perspective of an able-bodied lens. And what I mean by this is that disabled folks to survive have had to conform to some of these ideas about what disability is through participating in this type of film, and the ways that their bodies and minds are read by the larger point of society has oftentimes been in the context of a deficit or disability as a life in many ways that is tragic or filled with despair. And there, in the next slide, I've got just a quick kind of 10 historic depictions of disability and disabled people that have been taken from a list created by WordPress. And what it says here, I'll read the list of 10 kind of historic depictions. 1, pitiable and pathetic, sweet and innocent, a miracle cure. And so we can think of, for instance, Tiny Tim in like the Christmas specials that we've watched. 2, as a victim or an object of violence. 3, as being sinister or evil. 4, as atmosphere, as kind of curios or exotica in quote unquote freak shows, and in comics, horror movies, and science fiction. So as kind of background for those kinds of tropes. 5 as a super crypt, or the kind of triumph over tragedy story. So oftentimes these folks are depicted as having overcome tragedy, and that tragedy being their disability. 6 as laughable or the butt of jokes. 7 as having a chip on their shoulder or being aggressive kind of avengers. 8 as a burden or an outcast. 9 as being non-sexual or incapable of a worthwhile relationship. And 10, incapable of fully participating in everyday life. Oops. And I want to kind of provide this context because I think it's important to recognize the kind of insurmountable ways that disabled folks have faced really violent histories, and really the representation that they've had has been largely from this single narrative of deficit. Chimamanda Ngozi has said in the past that the easiest way to take away someone's agency is to tell their story for them. And I think that's what's happened here, is that there is just a single narrative of disability that's been consistent in our histories. And I think it's a way in which disability has largely been seen as something that is not part of everyday life, but rather this fracturing of the world that we live in. So unlike aging, for instance, which is seen as kind of a natural part of life, disability is not seen as that. And yet we know that there are many intersections in aging and disability. And I think we need to recognize the way that disability is a natural part of life, whether or not you are temporarily able-bodied or not. Disability is something that can and oftentimes does become part of one's lived experience at some point in their life. And this depiction of disability, I think, has also influenced and is simultaneously influenced by the arts, the kind of arts sector that we're in. So the first thing I want to talk about is in the next slide over here. I've got a picture of two kind of figures wrapped in string or in yarn, and they're sort of like referencing two figures in an embrace. It's a piece by Judith Scott, who is an artist that was part of the kind of outsider art movement. But when I say part of, I mean sort of that Judith Scott was kind of thrust into this outsider art movement. And what it is that the outsider art movement was a term that was coined in the 1970s to describe art created by someone outside of the community and boundaries of contemporary art movements. Oftentimes, these were folks who, may not have had formal or traditional artistic training and potentially invented their own techniques and styles. Outsider art was a really problematic way in which disability artists were included into the art sector, because it was oftentimes art that was stolen from the artists. Oftentimes it was not recognized as art until, a curator with their, curatorial eye, quote unquote, came into this, into a space and essentially assigned value to a piece that the art was given value. And outsider art was really problematic because these curators would oftentimes present the work as if having discovered these artists on their own, and that the art was not created with intention, that this artwork was essentially something that the artist didn't even recognize that they were creating. these artists were oftentimes not paid for the presentation of their work, or weren't given any sort of commission when the artworks were sold. They were oftentimes not invited to their own openings, and I think most problematic of all, they were often actively discouraged from participating in the arts sector, as a way to sort of maintain the quote unquote mystique of their kind of outsider art status. And this was a really problematic way, and it continues to influence how I think some disabled artists are unfortunately interpreted in even our art sector today. There is a growing kind of desire from artists to reclaim the outsider art movement, to really understand that they are outsider artists not because they, as disabled folks, are outside, but because the art world is keeping them from participating inside. And so I think there's a distinction there between outsider art that is reclaimed by artists versus outsider art being assigned automatically to disabled artists. In the next slide over here, I want to also talk about another way that disability and art intersect in kind of problematic ways. This one is, I think, a little bit less insidious in the ways that it creates kind of an intersection between disability and art, but unfortunately, it's one that's very pervasive and a lot of artists can't really escape. And that is the link between art therapy and disability arts. So there's a black and white photo over here that has examples of mindfulness-based art therapy. You know, it's got some animated pictures of, someone drawing a picture of themselves or using art to express their emotions. There's someone creating a collage, or, painting their foot and walking on a surface to create a piece of art. And it says, notice if you feel better after you make art. And I think art therapy has a lot of benefits. It can help relieve stress and promote self-esteem and improve concentration. But I think there's a problematic link between art therapy and disability arts, because art therapy in the professional, quote unquote, professional art sector is rarely considered professional. And so when disabled artists are trying to participate in the larger art sector, there's this conflation between their practice as being therapeutic and thus, not necessarily professional, as not being created with intention, or not being a practice that is, political or driven by, the artist. Rather, there is this kind of charitable sensation of disability arts being, good for the artist to do, and good for them to do this type of art, but not necessarily as a valued piece that is continuing to help push our arts ecology in advancing, the arts sector as a whole. And so I think there's a problematic link between art therapy that we also need to highlight when we're talking about the idea of disability arts and what it means to kind of curate and program disabled artists. And this kind of brings me to what disability arts, I've sort of said what disability arts isn't, and I want to instead think a bit about what disability arts might be. So there's a photo here of Ebony Rose Dark, who is a performer who performed at Tangled's Cripping the Arts Symposium in 2019. It was a presentation co-presented with Bodies in Translation, Ryerson University, Creative Users Project, and Harborfront Center. So this presentation, I think, was a really powerful way to create a demonstration of disability arts. And here, this was kind of one of the art presentations after the symposium itself. And the picture depicts kind of a black background, and lit in kind of bold white letters is VIP. And Ebony as a performer is lit in kind of this deep red, and they're wearing this kind of crown of what appears to be like sticks or twigs or perhaps branches coming out of their head, and they're holding their hair in this kind of like model pose. And I really love this image because it sort of plays off of the acronym VIP. So VIP would, in a sort of normative understanding of acronyms, the most popular iteration of it is very important person. And I think Ebony is, taking on that VIP and also understanding that it could mean a number of things. And Ebony, as a blind and low vision artist, is saying that they're also a visually impaired person. And I think there's something really beautiful about the way that they've extended the way that we could understand what a VIP is. A VIP is both, in this case, a very important person and a visually impaired person. And I think Ebony is embracing and playing off of that tongue-in-cheek understanding of what a VIP is. I think this is really like a beautiful demonstration of what disability arts can do, because it is simultaneously a powerful presentation, but it's also politically charged. It's also understanding that that the ways that disabled folks have in the past been represented is problematic, and it can, in very intentional ways, work to resist those kind of representations of disability. And I think there's a very powerful link between disability rights and justice and disability arts. In this next slide here, I've got exploring disability rights and justice, because I think it's important to have this kind of background as well when we're talking about inviting disabled folks into our spaces and into the programs that we do. So I'll start with disability rights. Disability rights, beginning in the 1950s, was a movement that was led to kind of establish things like the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act in the US, the Disability Discrimination Act in Australia, and the Disability Discrimination Act in England in 1995. Disability rights was very much legislatively based. It came as a kind of follow up to some of the progress created through the queer rights movement and the civil rights movement. And it was the first time that disability was understood as a human rights issue rather than a failing on one's own individual and independent self. So rather than locating disability necessarily solely within the body, it was an understanding that disabled folks should have access to the same spaces, the same things that are given to able-bodied individuals. And it was very much an attempt to create sort of these legislative-based rights for disabled folks. I think it was very important, and they were pieces of legislation that helped create access. But ultimately, I think they only defined the minimum requirements for access. And in addition, they didn't necessarily have the teeth at times to enforce this legislation. One piece that we can think of is the AODA, which is the Accessibility Ontarians Disability Act. And ultimately, while the AODA has a lot of really, I think, important requirements set out, they don't necessarily have the capacity to enforce a lot of the things that have been outlined in the AODA, unfortunately. But I think that disability rights did provide us a really important way of understanding disability. Historically, what's been prevalent is what's called the medical model. And there's a photo over here in this graphic that describes the medical model. So in it, there's a circle, for instance, with a person, a drawn picture of a person with the label "the problem," and the words "problem" are kind of going into them with arrows. And essentially, I think what the medical model is depicting is that the traditional view of the medical model is that disability is caused by, mental, physical, or sensory impairments. That it's the individual who's the person impaired, and so thus they are the problem. And the focus around the medical model is ideas of cure and creating cures for the impairment. But I think it's important to recognize that while impairments and chronic illness often pose, real difficulties, they are not necessarily the disabling factor. And the social model of disability, I think, helps to illuminate what the disabling factor, the real disabling factor for a lot of people is, which is that there are social barriers that exist. And in this next slide, there's a picture of another bubble that represents society, and that person is inside that bubble, and arrows are going out of the person with the word barrier. And so what's being kind of illustrated here is that the environment is what's inaccessible. That, for instance, buildings that are created without elevators or ramps, or buildings that are created with steps to go into the building, those are disabling factors. That services or language that isn't accessible to someone, that's a disabling factor. That if the communication style isn't accessible, then that's actually a disabling factor. Things like attitudes can be very disabling as well. The prejudices, the stereotyping, the discrimination that exists, those are attitudinal barriers for participation. And organizations as well can create these disabling factors. Organizations that are inflexible, for instance, or that have procedures that aren't accessible, those are disabling factors. And so the social model, I think, was a very revolutionary way to understand disability as something that wasn't located solely within the body, but rather as a social phenomenon. And so I want to talk about some of the language that's evolved with the disability rights movement. You may have noticed I've been saying disabled people. And I think that's because in the social model, disability's definition would be as an experience of exclusion or disadvantage. That people with actual or perceived impairments experience disability when they are disadvantaged as a direct result of that impairment, or due to the social, policy, or environmental barriers, like including discrimination or prejudicial attitudes. And then, people who may be disabled, they may or may not have impairments such as physical, mental, or learning conditions that could be evident or not. And these effects could be long-term, temporary, or fluctuating. And so I think there's a differentiating factor here in what is a disabling factor and what is an impairment that is experienced by an individual. Similarly, language has often been reclaimed as part of this movement, and I wanted to just make a note, when we're outreaching to the disability community, it's important to make distinctions because, for instance, deaf folks, and I'm spelling deaf with a capital D in this case, rather than a lowercase letter d. A lot of deaf folks identify as being culturally deaf. So they collectively share distinctive sign languages, values, traditions, histories, and norms. And deaf folks don't necessarily consider themselves disabled, right? Some deaf folks, not all deaf folks, feel that they are part of a linguistic minority, but not necessarily disabled. They are instead, I think, part of a cultural minority, the same way that any other cultural minority might might exist. And so I think it's important to make that distinction when you're outreaching, that perhaps you distinguish between deaf and disabled. Another similar term is mad. That's a reclaimed term. And I think the word mad, it challenges the discrimination and negative connotations of mental illness, and instead presents it as a diverse phenomenon of madness that's a source of identity and culture. So I think there are a lot of ways that we can talk about disability, and when I'm presenting, I'll often use disability as an umbrella term. For instance, when I say disability arts, I am referring to disability arts, mad arts, deaf arts, blindness arts. So there's not necessarily one umbrella term for disability arts, but for the sake of brevity, I will be using that to kind of represent the many practices that exist within disability arts. And I mentioned that there was disability rights and disability justice. And I think we need to make that distinction, that disability rights is something entirely different in of itself. Disability rights developed as a response to the perceived single issue identity basis and the leadership that historically centered white experiences in the disability rights movement. And so many feel that the disability rights movement left out other forms of oppression and the ways that privilege has been leveraged. One example of this is that disability rights really historically centered those with mobility impairments and perhaps marginalized other forms of impairments, mental health, deafness, blindness. It was oftentimes very centered around creating, barrier-free experiences in buildings, for instance. Disability rights was also largely a siloed issue. It was very much about the disability experience from white folks' perspectives. And so disability justice really centers and is led by queer and trans, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, disabled people. And so I think there is something very transformative about the ways in which disability justice also links back to other movements and brings disability as an issue outside of the kind of historic ways in which disability rights largely centered it around whiteness. There's a photo here that I really love from Sin's Invalid. It's a photo of a Black female presenting person in a wheelchair. They're dressed in an orange jumpsuit. It might be a reference to a prison uniform. And that person is reaching out an arm to another female presenting person of color with a hijab, and that person has bandages around their arms and legs. They don't have hands or feet. And the photo says, disability justice means resisting together. From solitary cells to open air prisons, to exist is to resist. And so I think this picture is really trying to represent that disability justice is really centering queer and trans, disabled, BIPOC folk. and it's trying to create leadership for those who are the most impacted. There's a fantastic quote here by disability justice activist, Mia Mingus, who says, "We don't want to simply join the ranks of the privileged. We want to dismantle those ranks and the systems that maintain them." And I think this is really a fantastic quote because it talks about basically the ways that disability justice is trying really to create transformational change, that it's about how we might change the framework of disability, and how ableism is really very persistent in and ingrained in our society. There's a definition of ableism that I think has really been an aha moment for a lot of folks. So I'm going to read this. It's a working definition by Talila T.L. Lewis in conversation with disabled, Black, and other negatively racialized folk, especially Dustin P. Gibson. And it's a definition that's in the style of a dictionary definition on a brown background. And it says, ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people in society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's appearance and or their ability to satisfactorily, in parentheses, reproduce, excel, and quote unquote behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. And this definition, I think, has been really powerful in helping us to understand the different ways that ableism has really been a framework that's upheld white supremacy, that's upheld the different ways that the movements, that different ways of oppression have existed. So we have to include ableism in our analysis of oppression, because ultimately ableism is about how people participate in society against this mythic norm, this idea of whiteness, this idea of capitalism, this productive, able-bodied, heteronormative individual that is always being compared to. And so ableism, I think, needs to be included in our analysis of oppression. Mia Mingus, talks about the ways that we can understand that ableism has upheld these different systems that, for instance, how queerness was oftentimes justified as the discrimination against queer folks was oftentimes justified through an ableist lens, through, for instance, assigning queer folks as mentally ill, or, for instance, the different eugenic ways in which anti-Blackness and racism manifested through slavery, and this was through the rationalization that BIPOC folk weren't as as productive or as smart as white folks. And I think there were a lot of ways in which ableism was the justification for the different forms of oppression that have existed. And so we can't actually have an analysis of oppression until we include ableism in these stories. And an important part of disability justice is manifesting disability culture. I think, there's a photo here of a number of accessibility icons which have been played with by an artist named Valentine Brown. these images, so accessibility icons, actually, I should step back and explain accessibility icons first. These are icons that you can include in, for example, your marketing to signify that you have certain features, certain accessibility features in your event or your program. And what Valentine's done is kind of created these really beautiful and sort of a little bit macabre kind of interpretations of accessibility icons. And for instance, there's 4 over here. The one on the left is a picture of an ear, and there's sort of this weird tube coming out of it. It looks like potentially some sort of tendril or some sort of potentially like a electrical tube coming out. In the left corner, second left icon, there's a picture of someone's lips and their nose, and it looks like there are little kind of, sprouts coming out of the lips in a way that it might suggest that that person is creating a shushing sound. To the right of that is a heart made out of like little tendrils, and then to the right of that is the figure of a hand created in similar tendrils, creating the sign for I love you in ASL. So, I and then L, and it's coming towards you. And I think it's important to note here that culture is really important because culture is a manifestation of collectively expressed, it's a manifestation of collectivity expressed through the arts, history, language, customs, and practices. It's ultimately about the ways that we participate in society, I think, distilled and presented through culture. And so if we aren't represented in the cultural spaces we take up, then we're not having full access to life itself. And so this is where I think disability arts comes into play. And I'm hesitant to necessarily create a single definition that captures disability art, but I think it's generally agreed that disability arts is a specific arts practice that involves disability artists creating work that expresses their identity as disabled people. Disability arts carry an additional dimension of meaning that as disability arts practitioners move their work forward individually and collectively, they are contributing to an expression of distinct disability culture with unique experiences, perspectives, and shared values. And I think ultimately this definition of disability arts is a really powerful one because it really illuminates the way that disability arts and culture is really necessary in terms of creating a vibrant way in which disability can be something that we live with and something that we can embrace. And I think disability arts is oftentimes presented as this new arts movement, but disability arts is actually very old, and the aesthetics of disability has been something that's been co-opted for time immemorial. So I'm going to read the definition of disability aesthetics as Tobin Siebers, a disability scholar, has given us. Disability aesthetics prizes physical and mental difference as a significant value in itself, affirming that disability operates both as a critical framework for questioning aesthetic presuppositions in the history of art and as a value in its own right, important to future conceptions of what art is. And I think a good example of this manifestation of disability aesthetics is in the Venus de Milo. So there's a picture to the left of the marble bust of the Venus de Milo. The Venus is like a goddess or a Roman kind of figure, a mythical figure. And in this the famous Venus de Milo piece depicts Venus with broken is a broken figure without arms, or she only has shoulders. And art historians have long debated the significance of this. You know, would the Venus de Milo be an iconic figure if it was presented as a piece with arms? And I think, you know, what's really being identified here by Tobin is the way that the Venus's imperfection is actually what is drawing us to this piece as an iconic figure. And so the Venus is really is in some ways a disability, is employing disability aesthetics while not necessarily being created by a disabled artist. And so disability aesthetics, I think, are very important, but we need to understand that it is a co-opting of these aesthetics. If, you know, someone has a figure of the Venus de Milo, do they necessarily understand the political ways that they are trying to participate in the art world? Do they understand the different barriers that exist, or the different rights that disabled folks have to fight for? Not necessarily. And so I think disability aesthetics has to be employed from within our community and disability. But I think it's important to note that disability aesthetics exists because historically the arts sector has valued disability, and the way that imperfection actually plays a large role in kind of our arts history. So when I talk about disability aesthetics and how disabled folks can really reclaim these aesthetics, I think, you know, this example that I provided here is really powerful. There's to the left an artist, a performer named Aaron Ball, who is shooting confetti out of their prosthesis, and so they are kind of tilted back in this kind of joyous kind of look. They're sitting on their wheelchair, and the confetti is shooting straight out upwards in an upward motion. To the right are two performers, Brian Solomon and Justin Many Fingers, performing at Cripping the Arts as well. And they are two artists that have sort of found each other and created this really beautiful performance based off of the ways that Justin, for instance, with many fingers, and Brian with less so, kind of complement each other. And the way that they've found each other has, I think, really beautifully been underscored through the way that the number of fingers is sort of in going in opposite directions. You know, Justin with many and Brian with less. And I think this is a really beautiful employment of the kind of disability aesthetic with its full political potential realized by it being created by disabled folks with a disability platform, with accessibility as an integral part of what it is that they're doing here. And this is my favorite way of understanding disability arts. There's a quote on the screen by Yinka Shonibare, who's a really famous disability artist in the UK. He is a Turner Prize nominated and blue chip artist. He's originally from Nigeria, and he's done a lot of work around understanding colonialism in Africa as well as disability arts. And Yinka, in an interview, once said that disability arts can be seen as the last remaining avant-garde arts movement. And I think this is a really important way of understanding disability arts, because Yinka is paralleling the emergence of disability arts as a recognized movement to the emergence of, other avant-garde movements, feminist art, Black arts, queer arts. Disability, Yinka notes, is something that's still largely misunderstood in society. And so in order to really present disability arts in the fullness and in the political potential that we might want to understand it, then we have to understand that disability arts is still an avant-garde arts movement that we don't necessarily fully understand, and its presentation can still be something that people are grappling with. And so, I think ultimately disability arts is situated both within and outside of the larger art context that Yinka is talking about. And it creates opportunities for experimentation and play in ways that perhaps other artists might not feel ready to experiment with. And I just quickly want to highlight some of the different disability artists that have presented at Tangled before I get into some of the tools that we can work with in disability arts, and some of the actual ways that we might create accessibility. Because I think it's really great for us to create access, but I think what's even better is inviting disabled folks in and creating that access together with disabled artists. Um, I'm going to start off with Bruce Horak because I think there's something really beautiful about Bruce's own journey as a disabled artist. Bruce is a painter and a performer and someone who identifies as blind. And Bruce initially painted with very kind of hyper real styles. So he would create like landscapes and pictures of like lighthouses, and they were all done in a style that was meant to be more realistic. And it wasn't until this piece, Through a Tired Eye, that Bruce began to recognize his own kind of aesthetic. I think he had been drawing another landscape piece, and it just didn't fit what he had wanted it to. And so instead, he started painting everything he saw: the murkiness, the auras, the different kind of particles floating in his peripheral vision. And so what came at the end of it was a piece that sort of, to me, represents potentially an iris. It's got the center circle, and with concentric kind of auras and floaters kind of coming out of it, and it's white in the middle, and it branches out into kind of tones of reds and yellows and blacks. And I think there's something really beautiful about the way that this piece was kind of the initiating piece for Bruce to begin incorporating his own way of seeing the world rather than what he perceived as the necessary way of presenting work. Two more artworks. On the left is a piece by Valentine Brown, another piece by Valentine Brown, which is a picture of a knitted like textile piece. It's got these tendrils in stuffed nylon stockings kind of strewn across the picture, and there's these unfired terracotta kind of remains on the table. And There's two sets of hands. They're actually Kristina and my hands reaching out and touching this piece called Big Softy. And in the middle is this crocheted heart. It's kind of got these little tendrils coming out of it. And Valentine created this piece as a way to create access for folks. And so it's a touchable work, and it's got little surprises in them, different textures. If you touch the right place, it'll squeak. And I think that was a way to think about, the different sensorial experiences that could exist for audiences. And similarly, to the right is a sculpture from a larger exhibition called Constructed Identities at McMaster University. And this piece here is really special because Persimmon did create some touchable works, but there were some that were really delicate that she couldn't let us touch. And this was one of the works. Originally, when Persimmon had created her Constructed Identities exhibition, the first iteration of that exhibition was debuted at Tangled Art Gallery, and all the pieces were kind of these floating figures, with different found objects, different Barbie dolls and materials found from the beach, scrap metal parts, collectively used to create the figure of a doll. And Persimmon oftentimes exchanged materials with other disabled artists. She, for instance, had an exchange going with Jeff McMurtry, another disability artist and advocate, who unfortunately passed away in 2017. And when Jeff passed away, he had left a box of materials for Persimmon. They were these little bones that he had collected over time, and they used to ship to and from each other's places. And so when Jeff passed away, Persimmon received this box, and she realized, she had been creating a lot of pieces that had been floating figures, but these could be misinterpreted as standing figures. And she thought, in order to really enact some disability solidarity, she had to create these figures that were seated. Like, it was a calling to her to recognize, the ways that even disability artists can continue to push their aesthetics and push themselves in how they present their pieces. And so this was a really special one of the first seated figure that Persimmon created. I've got another picture of Body Farm here by Valentine Brown, and I just wanted to have this picture up because I wanted to highlight a couple of ways that we create access in the gallery. So the piece here, there's the Big Softy that I just described on kind of a teal green table, and there are a ton of two-dimensional work, paintings and drawings flanking either side on the walls. And the very back, in between two pillars, is a stuffed, nylon stocking installation that has the words "Release Me" created with these pieces, and it casts a shadow in the back that says "Release" and "Me." And then finally, in the back, there are two audio stations, and those are actually the audio description that was created for this piece. For all of the Tangled exhibitions, and I'm talking physically right now, but I think it's important to make that link between what is digital access and what is physical, kind of in-person access. So at the gallery, we will always have our works hung at a lower level to accommodate folks of shorter stature and wheelchair users. We will oftentimes have something multisensory. We always have something multisensory. So whether it's something you can touch, something that vibrates, something that you can listen to, or something that you can perhaps sense in a different way, a sensory experience, I think, is really important so that we can engage folks who might not have access to sight. And in this case, Valentine had over 200 um, pieces, like different drawings and paintings, sculptural pieces. And so it wasn't necessarily feasible to create an entire audio description because that would have been this really long um, narrative that wouldn't necessarily suit the art piece. And so we thought it was really important to create a more creative audio description. And that's what you'll hear in the backs of the pieces there. And as well, there were QR codes that folks could scan in order to listen to the SoundCloud iteration of the audio description. So those are a couple of ways, and not by no means is it all the ways, but a couple of the ways that we create and manifest access in our exhibitions. There's another photo just from the other side of the gallery, and you'll see that next to our written exhibition statement, there's also a video playing, and that video is an ASL translation of the pieces that of the exhibition statement pieces. There's another exhibition here, Own Your Cervix by Vanessa Dion Fletcher. And in it, there's kind of this sort of Victorian furniture. There's a big settee and two seats. There's a number of embroidered hoops with what appear to be like stains of red, and as well an audio station in the back. And I just wanted to highlight Vanessa's piece because Vanessa spoke about how being in a disability gallery, being in a space where there was time to explain the different pieces, where you could create a sense of intimacy by having someone at Tangled. We always have someone there to help guide folks, to provide a curatorial tour, or to provide some sort of explanation for the works that exist. And Vanessa's piece in particular was about creating an installation that spoke to the ways that colonization has really taken hold of our bodies. So the way that medical professionals oftentimes understand our bodies better than we do. Vanessa wanted to reclaim that, and she would use materials like her own menstrual blood to amplify, these pieces of furniture, or she would embroider beads into these circles, into these hoops. And Vanessa talks a lot about how her piece was oftentimes misconstrued as sort of a second wave feminist throwback, to period blood and some of those problematic associations between gender and sexuality. And instead, Vanessa really was appreciative that at Tangled, her piece was read much clearer thanks to the access that existed, because it helped people to understand that actually it was a piece, it was an exhibition about the ways that colonization have taken hold of our bodies, and how this can actually be a way to help ourselves to understand our bodies better, rather than necessarily this kind of second wave feminist throwback. I spoke a bit about how disability arts can be really these avant-garde practices, and I think Claude Whitman, who presented at the 7A11D festival, has really taken advantage of the different ways that disability constraints that exist can be subverted through art. And in this piece here, what Claude has done is, the piece is called Drop In and I Will Pay You $15 an hour. We will build bicycle wheels together to fundraise money for a lawyer. And the piece, there's a snapshot of that invitation in this slide. And what Claude's doing is he is using his artist fee as a way to subvert some of the restrictions that folks on ODSP might experience. For instance, folks at ODSP are not allowed to hire folks to help them do, hire people to do anything business related. And so Claude is subverting that through this artist fee and using the arts institution as a way to create the parameters for a performance that would have people paid through his artist fee, essentially. And I think this was a really powerful way to subvert the limitations that politically exist right now for disabled folks through art. And finally, I just want to talk about another piece that exists. So Tangled is always trying to create more capacity for disability artists to curate their own shows and to program in a way that it's not always reliant solely on Tangled. So in this exhibition called Hidden by Gloria Swain, Gloria was the curator, and she invited 5 artists to participate. And one of the artists, unfortunately, wasn't able to make it anymore. And there was definitely enough time to bring another artist in with the time frame that we had. But Gloria wanted to step back for a minute and instead think about what this space meant. Gloria, as an aging Black, disabled, mad artist, has always really wanted to hold and create space for other folks. And so to her, the spirit of bringing another artist in perhaps didn't match with the spirit of Hidden as an exhibition. And I think she created a very powerful demonstration of disability justice by holding that space empty and creating a statement here to acknowledge not only the artists who couldn't be there today, but rather all the artists who perhaps can't necessarily conform to this kind of pace of disability arts or the arts ecology in general. Because as much as I think Tangled creates space that's possible for others, I think we are constantly rethinking and unlearning our practices. And so the idea of creating more space for an artist, I think, was a very powerful learning that we had, and how we might demonstrate disability justice in similar ways. I think this has been a very important part to helping us learn about some of those moments. So I think what I've really been trying to underscore here is that the risks of disability art has to come from the body minds of disabled artists. And I've got to the left a kind of controversial piece, a disability arts piece by someone named Mark Quinn, who's not disabled, who created this bust of a disabled activist named Alison Lapper, who is pregnant, in Trafalgar Square. And there's been a lot of controversy over this piece because, on the one hand, Alison, as a disabled person, has the agency for sure to model for Mark Quinn. But there's a lot of questions around the choices, the artistic choices made around presenting this piece, and the power dynamics that exist between Mark as kind of this famous blue chip artist and Alison Lapper as a disabled artist. And so I think for us at Tangled, we really want to underscore that these risks need to come from disabled artists. And so we're finally at manifesting access. And I know this is what everyone's kind of come for. And Kristina, who is much better than I am at these ideas, is going to be able to illuminate these more. But I think before we get into the how, we need to understand what it means to manifest access. I've got a picture here that I'm not going to fully describe because it's not very clear. But it's the bodies in translation principles of governance and engagement. And in this picture, there's just there's a number of different principles that inform each other. And I think it was really important to put this image here because it shows the richness and the many ways in which disability, arts, and justice can manifest. And so there's, points like leading with difference, enacting radical reciprocity, manifesting access, decolonizing in intersectional ways. And these are all, I think, different principles for how disability justice and art can manifest themselves. I do want to highlight one definition that is difficult to see here, but it's a reclaiming of the word crypt. And the word crypt is obviously a reclaimed term, but there are a number of manifestations of what the word crypt can mean. But I like to use it as a verb. I like to think of it as an active verb that whose definition was given to us by disability scholar Kelly Fritsch. And what Kelly Fritsch, and the way Kelly Fritsch uses this definition is that she says to crypt is to open with desire for the ways that disability disrupts. And I think this is really important because when we're cripping the arts, then we're actually understanding that we are opening with desire for the disruption of disability, the political potential of disability in our arts sector. And so manifesting access is ultimately about cultivating the different living agreements that exist between members and parties in a space together. It's about cripping the space that we experience and disrupting normative presumptions about what it is that a space can and should be when we're inviting others into it. I wanted to highlight a exhibition that I co-curated at Critical Distance with Emily Cook. And there's a piece here that I wanted to highlight because it's really interesting. This exhibition was called Access is Love and Love is Complicated. And one of the pieces that was included is by Andy Slater called Tap and Roll. So Andy is a blind, low vision artist who creates sound art. And Andy wanted to create access for his sound pieces. And so he created this really beautiful book of audio descriptions of this tap and roll piece. They were so it became so integral to the piece though, that it ultimately created inaccessibility because the works served not only as a description, but as a very intrinsic way of accessing this piece. The poetry wasn't necessarily a physical description of what was happening, but rather an interpretation. And so it became almost ironic that the access created for this piece then disabled Andy's own community from accessing the full piece. And so he then created a Braille version of this book, and then he created a simple description. And it was this really interesting kind of progression as Andy began to wonder, like, should he create an ASL interpretation of this poetry? Does he then need to describe that ASL? Like, where does kind of that cycle end? And it was this really curious way in which we wanted to explore what is access. What are these complicated ways that we can tie our community together? Because historically, right, because we were living under the medical model, disability was located solely in our bodies, and it was isolating. And access, as Mia Mingus would say, is actually a manifestation of a manifestation of a way to resist those isolationist histories. And so access is about gathering. And I think gathering for disabled folks is still relatively radical because we've so historically been taught that disability was located solely in ourselves, that now to create community means that we're going to experience different conflicting access needs, that we don't necessarily have all the best practices yet to create an accessible space. And so I never say that we're fully accessible, because I think that is a bit of a lie. I think that we can strive to be accessible. We can orient ourselves towards this crypt horizon, this idea similarly to the queer horizon that Jose Esteban Munoz like has theorized, that queerness can never be here, that disability can never fully manifest as long as it's an able-bodied, ableist society that we live in. So we can gesture towards a crypt horizon. We can always work to have and to always unlearn our understandings of accessibility, but we will never, I think, get to a place where we can say we're fully accessible. And that's one reason why I think a checklist for access is not necessarily helpful all the time. It is definitely helpful for starting out to understand how you can build your events, your programs, your artistry, but we always need to think with a critical mind about how it is that we are including others. That, for example, with Valentine's piece, because his exhibition had so many works, we couldn't create a normal, quote unquote, normal audio description. We had to create something more creative and more tied to the works themselves, because otherwise you'd create this long audio description that no one realistically would listen to. And so it's about thinking with a critical edge when we manifest access, that I think we can gesture and advance towards that crypt horizon. Oops. Okay, sorry. So I want to come together to do a quick exercise. But before we do that, I need to give everyone a little bit of background. We're going to do an exercise about audio description, because I think that's been a fundamental part of how it is that we curate art and how we present art at Tangled. Audio description, and here it says The Fundamentals of Audio Description by Joel Snyder. Joel Snyder is a advocate for blind and low vision folks, and he helped to create the initial standard for audio description. So Joel Snyder, one of he has four observations, four kind of frameworks for creating audio description. And he notes that audio description provides narration of the visual elements, action, costumes, settings, and the like of theater, television, museums, and other events. And so basically, in summary, it's the visual made verbal. And there's four sort of steps in doing so. You need to observe, you need to edit, you need to think about the language and tone that exists, and you need to think about essentially how you can create an audio description using those four different elements. So when I'm thinking about audio description, the first thing I wanted to highlight is basically how I myself think about audio description. What is your first impression? What are the factual characteristics of a piece? You need to communicate some of those things. It's a translation of this gestalt of information, and you have to think about creating this in a linear line of translation. So the way that I like to think about the piece, a piece that I'm describing, for instance, is to first take the literal interpretation of it. Is it a paper cup? Is it a white paper cup? Does it have a brown sleeve? Does it have a black lid? On the sleeve, is there any lettering? These are all things that help create the literal interpretation of the piece. Then secondary is the meaning or the curatorial or contextual approach that's being taken here. What are we describing? What are we describing? Where and when? What's the background information? And then finally, if I have time, I'll get into a more subjective response. And you need to feel the appropriateness of this. Does this piece remind you of blank? When you saw it, did you think of blank? When you go into a gallery, you usually look at the piece first and then the label second. And so perhaps you want to recreate that experience in your audio description. So you might not want to necessarily provide all the factual kind of pieces first, but rather you might want to create the first impression of what it is first. For instance, if something appears to be glass, but then turns out to be plastic, it might actually be more authentic to describe that it looks like glass before saying that, oh, but it is actually made of plastic. So you're not necessarily creating just a description, but you're actually thinking about how the piece is interpreted. And so that's why audio description is very subjective. And you need to try to be as aware as you can of what's subjective and what's not. So what I wanted to do is create an audio description together. I wanted everyone to sort of think about these ideas of how to create audio description. And I want us to imagine a nesting doll almost. So the nesting doll comprises of the initial gestalt of information, that initial literal piece of information. Then the second kind of interpretation is the meaning, the curatorial context. What is it? Where is it? When is it? And then the third, the final, is the subjective response. What does this piece remind you of when you see it? And so I'm going to put up an image, a very kind of complicated, actually, image. And I'm going to see if we can potentially describe this together. And I think there are no wrong answers. I welcome anyone to add to the chat, or feel free to shout out anything that you hear, and we can try to create a bit of an audio description together in this moment. So if you can open your chat feature, I'd like everyone to first take 3 to 5 minutes to think about a verbal description for this piece. And I do have the kind of wall text that you might see at a gallery next to this piece. But I want us to sort of first put that out of what it is we're interpreting. And instead, everyone take 3 to 5 minutes to create a bit of a description for this piece. And once you're done, please put them in the chat, and we can together perhaps come to a place where we have one final description for this piece. Just going to kind of keep giving a bit of advice as you're working on this. You can think about some of these ways that you may want to divide up the piece. You could think about it from a perspective of, what is the foreground, what is the background. You could divide the piece into quadrants, or you could describe it according to, some sort of clock shape. You might want to describe from the 12 o'clock to going clockwise. Here's what is happening on this screen. So I've gotten a question about how we might describe it as well, but I think it's really important to note this moment. So we might want to avoid saying, we see this, or this appears to be this, because I think ultimately it's about trying to create access for that person. So you can say this, you can say it appears to be this, but I would avoid saying that you interpret it directly in one way, if that makes any sense. Like you can create a metaphor, for example, or you can say it appears to be a tree, or it references the shape of a tree, or it reminds us of Christmas lights or something like that. And I think audio description is sort of a muscle you have to continue to work, so that you can find words that really help describe in the simplest way, you know, words like, oh, it flanks the sides, or um like, oh, the foreground resembles this, or reminds me of this, or shaped like this. Like, I think ways that you can create the quickest and simplest message is really important, and it's a muscle that you continue to essentially develop. So I'm going to give one more minute, and then I'd like everyone who feels comfortable to put something in the chat if you could. Okay, so we have one really great description in the chat. Oh, we've got two. These are really fantastic. I'm reading through these. So what I'd like everyone to do is just to take a look in the chat at the different descriptions that have been created, because I think everyone has added something in ways that we might not expect, right? So talking about a background for some, finding, some folks might find that word that you were looking for, you know, tendril, that's really fantastic, or tree branch, talking about the different ways that something's electrified, talking about the different shades, or the different ways that this maybe mimics a brain. I think that's really beautiful. And talking about the different brush strokes you see, talking about the different ways that you know talking about the different ways that you've divided up this painting, because I think you could section this, in a way that makes it look like it's perhaps a landscape with some sort of celestial body rising, and perhaps there's glowing trees. There's with these kind of, you could interpret them as lights or fruits. And thinking about the way the no, no, no is repeated. You don't want to, the last thing you want to say is how many no's are there? Nobody's really going to understand the difference between 15 to 20 no's. Like, I think that's less necessary than saying that there are a number of speech bubbles. Perhaps they're floating out of one of the, like, the tentacles or the branches. Perhaps you can talk about the ways the hands are gesturing towards those bubbles, perhaps almost reaching out, or maybe you're interpreting the hands as reaching to the trees instead. And so there's a number of ways that we can interpret this piece. And I think it's really important that we see the different ways that one piece can be interpreted in so many ways, right? Like, I love the idea of that perhaps this looks like Christmas lights to somebody, and to someone else it looks like fireflies. I think that's really rich, and I think that creates this sense of wonder in this piece. if you are, part of an organization and you're creating audio description, there is a lot of training that's available. If you're doing this on the fly for someone, it might be helpful to have a conversation with them after you've done the description to ask them about what was maybe unclear, or like different things that you could elaborate on. Maybe they'll pick up on something and ask like, oh, how does this work? And you can elaborate on this piece. And I think the audio description can create a very powerful narrative in a work, because it can allow for us to analyze the work in ways that we perhaps didn't before. What is this image? Like, there's something very interesting going on, but there isn't one. It doesn't necessarily look like any one thing. And so I think these descriptions that we have, if it's stylized, we have to talk about what kind of style is it, or does it remind you of a different style? Perhaps you can talk about the process-based look of this piece, because you actually almost see the brush strokes here. So if anyone would like further feedback on their description, you can either message me privately and we can look at your piece together when Kristina's speaking, or you can email me and we could have another conversation, or you can drop into our next Thursday meeting to talk about audio description and the do's and don'ts a little bit further. But I'm just going to get into one last thing, which is talking about people, which is something very different. And like I'd mentioned, you can feel free to pose questions, but we will try to hold those till the after Kristina's presented. So one thing that's really interesting is that the Accessible Media Inc. standards for description actually doesn't ask us to describe race unless it's quote unquote relevant to the story. And this is the same for disability, physical disability, but not for gender. And there's some very interesting guidelines around how audio description is created in the mainstream. One of the folks that we've worked with, Rebecca Singh, has recently published a draft that's forthcoming to the Routledge handbook for audio description. And Rebecca's created some new policy around anti-racism in audio description that we're trying to incorporate. So one, Rebecca says, always describe everyone's race. Prioritize the attempt to do this. For audio description users, understanding racism, which is everywhere, just requires describers to name race. Two, present the information coherently. The person's race can be described as follows. So the name, the cast as the character name, and then you describe both race within the actor's name, and then describe the character for the character name. And then this is very important. I think don't ever just describe people who are BIPOC with their race. So I think this is really important because there's this assumed whiteness, this assumed able-bodiedness, this assumed way in which people are being presented, and it's not until it's quote unquote relevant to the story, or that it's quote unquote intrusive to the environment that you need to describe it. And so Rebecca Singh is really trying to change this framework by asking us to always describe everyone's race, to always describe that. And I think it's really important. And we always prioritize people's own descriptions as well. So creating a bit of a description for myself, for example, I always elaborate. I'm East Asian, I'm visibly disabled, and then I go into what I'm wearing. And that's how I think Rebecca might suggest we do an audio description of ourselves. So that is it for. Oh wait, no, sorry. a lot more points that Rebecca had elaborated on. So just following up with that, she asked us to use the most specific term possible for the person being referred. So, for example, don't just use the umbrella term BIPOC, but maybe include with African descent or mixed race. And she's asked us to avoid some outdated and demeaning terms like non-white or minorities. And Rebecca, as someone who's also someone who is mixed race, has also put in, avoid using any animal husbandry terms. So like mixed breed or half breed, like those are really offensive terms and outdated terms. I think something that Tangled is also working on right now is culminating a diverse group of BIPOC, blind and partially sighted stakeholders or consultants that we pay so that we can continuously update our practices, stay up to date with language, and be actively anti-racist. So those are the other points to Rebecca's contribution in the Routledge Handbook. And so with that is the end of my session. I'd like for us to take around a 7-minute break, come back at 1:10, where Kristina will be presenting.
Thank you, Sean, for that fulsome discussion on disability arts and accessible curatorial practices in Canada. I always feel insecure following you when we present together, even though we've been doing it for 4 years. And so this talk, or this section of the talk, is really about how we can take all of those principles that Sean spoke about and bring them into an accessible and inclusive marketing campaign or strategy for our arts events, arts programming, arts experiences in Ontario or in our respected cities. So I'm going to start today by kind of going over like what I mean by communications, and what it means to have good communications, what it means to have Crypt communications. Some ways in which we can bring those into, on the screen it says internal and external communications. That should say targeted and untargeted communication. I apologize. And then we're going to go into our workshop section, which is part 3 and part 4, which is how we are building access into our marketing deliverables. Then we're going to do...
Wait, Kristina?
Yes?
Sorry. Have you moved slides? I don't think it changed.
It hasn't changed?
No. Maybe try the other way.
The Zoom life, it's so hard. Okay, can we see...
Yes.
Okay. Well, I apologize that you're gonna now see my Adobe deck. Is it like, okay, whatever. We're good. Everyone's good now?
It looks good.
Okay. So part 2 should read targeted and untargeted communications. I apologize for that. Part 3 and 4 are our kind of breakout workshop sessions, which will kind of operate much like Sean did with the image descriptions. However, I'm going to be asking you to work on your own devices, whether that is your phone or your computer. So I am a presenter who wants you to text in class. And then we're going to go over some resources that I use in my practice that I think will be helpful for you. And then we will lead into the Q&A for myself and Sean. So what is actually communication when I say that this is a presentation on inclusive and accessible marketing communication? So essentially communication is just how we tell somebody else or another body of people an idea, a topic, a thing that we want them to know. So communication can be verbal, like I am doing now. It can be written in the way of an email, a Facebook post, a tweet, a press release, and it can be visual, in the way of an Instagram post or even a Facebook post with images. All of these tools allow us to share with our community and our audiences what we are doing and why we are doing it. And there are lots of ways in which we can use tools to make sure those communication, visual, written, and verbal, to be accessible and be inclusive and support the building of community that we have created in all of these steps that Sean outlined with building accessible curatorial practices into our practice in our own work. So then what is good communication? Right now, we kind of have been inundated in a society that believes that good communication is communication that adds to our financial value, or it adds to the success metrics of how many people read it or how many people engage with it. And there is merit to that kind of good communication, but it doesn't necessarily embrace or speak to the fact that us as arts practitioners in Ontario, all of us that are here have an interest in access and inclusion and a socially justice-minded way. So I kind of reject that a notion of good communication is one that increases our awareness or increases our bottom line, but rather communication that gives power and agency to marginalized and vulnerable members of society. Sean mentioned a Mia Mingus quote that is, access is a manifestation of the resistance of isolation. And I reference Mia Mingus quite a lot in my practice, and she was kind of the inspiration for how I define communication here, in that when we are giving agency and power to our marginalized and vulnerable members of society, we are resisting the oppressive nature, and we can do that through communication. And when we do not use our communication as a way of resisting oppression and giving power and agency, it's not really considered good, even if it is expanding our arts practice or our organizational awareness, or even if it is making us money. So then how does Crypt communication distinguish itself from just good communication? There is kind of this idea that good communication doesn't have to inherently be Crypt. And this was kind of what Sean was referencing a little bit in his presentation of like art about disability isn't necessarily disability arts or Crypt arts. So we can have these tools of good communication that don't lean into the definition of Crypt, that is welcoming with desire the disruption that disability presents. So then Crypt communication is communication that disrupts those dominant narratives of oppression against disabled folks and vulnerable members of society. So this would be a really big example that I see of Crypt communication would be the example that Sean mentioned, the VIP image. So not only is this using something that is understood in society, it's communicating something we all kind of have a collective conscience around. It is disrupting a dominant narrative of oppression. It is an artist claiming that they are a VIP despite the dominant narratives of oppression against disabled folks. As well, it is doing this agency affirming and power affirming, like I mentioned, good communication of someone's own identity as a, start that sentence over. Not only is it disrupting the dominant narrative of oppression against disabled folks by claiming VIP as a label, it's also using our collective understanding of the term visually impaired person as a site of agency and power, like I had mentioned in quote unquote good communication. Some of these ways that we can also decide if something is good communication or Crypt communication is it disrupting those environmental, attitudinal, and organizational behaviors of ableism that Sean had mentioned? Are we disrupting environmental ableism in our communication? Are we disrupting attitudinal behaviors of ableism in our communication? Are we disrupting organizational behaviors of ableism in our communication? That disruptive element, that agency affirming element, that power affirming agent aspect of giving disabled and vulnerable members of society agency and power is what inherently makes our communication good and what makes it inherently correct. So then how do we see this in our external communications? So to talk about this, I talk a little bit about the fact that like when we see external communications, a lot of it is centered in social media. So we had the big social media giants, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. As well, we have other ways of digitally engaging with people, and that would be our website, our email newsletters, our targeted email, etc., and so forth. But external communication is really just anything that we are producing as artists and art professionals that we want a broader audience to see, that we want people who aren't in our staff and aren't in our immediate circles and immediate collective communities to know about. That these external communications are ways of externally and publicly affirming agency and power for vulnerable and marginalized folks and disrupting those dominant narratives of ableism. So to have that kind of external communication, it's not enough for us to just desire that disabled people come to our spaces, for mad folks to come to our spaces, for deaf folks to come to our spaces. We actually have to imagine our community in our spaces with empathy before they even arrive. So if we are producing an event in which we want mobility device users to come, how is a mobility device user going to actually enter your space? If you are not a mobility device user yourself, what are the ways in which you can disrupt the normative ways of you being in the world to see how will somebody who's using a mobility device actually enter my space? How can I use communication to imagine them before they arrive? Same with deaf folks, like how are deaf folks actually engaging? Are you already booking ASL interpreters before you even promote or externally communicate everything by noting that you imagine that there will be deaf folks in our space entirely? A lot of our gathering is online right now as opposed to in person. So there's not a lot of sensory accommodations that we necessarily need to make to our own space, but are you bringing in ways in which individuals who are engaging with our digital space can turn on and off their cameras, come in and out of the space, if they can access information in various ways like closed captioning, ASL interpretation, recordings after the fact. These ways in which we as cultural producers, arts administrators, take empathy into these various experiences with disability or with deafness or with madness or with something along the Crypt umbrella, we can inherently increase our ability to disrupt narratives of ableism and grant power and agency to marginalized folks by just imagining people in our space before they enter. So what are targeted versus untargeted communication? I kind of referenced this a little bit before when I was talking about all the social media giants, but I'm kind of going to go through what is actually distinguished between targeted and untargeted communication and what might different audiences need to know. So our targeted communication, or our untargeted communication, are people who are already engaging with our work. They are following us on Twitter. They are following us on Facebook. They're following us on Instagram. They followed us on our website, on our newsletter. All of those things they are already engaging with. So we know that regardless of what we produce in our external communication, they will see in some tangential way. And so this kind of untargeted communication can be a little bit more general. It can be a little bit more event specific. It can be a little bit more casual and conversational because we are engaging with people who already know us and know our work. They know what access policies we have. They know kind of what our general ethos is, and they're already interested in what we're doing. So they've kind of done a little bit of the work by clicking follow on Facebook, by clicking follow on Twitter, by clicking follow and liking us on Instagram. And so there's a way that we can use this relationship to kind of not have to always start from ground zero of building up this empathy practice. But then we get into targeted communications, and we're seeing this would be like advertising, event postings. But then we also have a lot of the similar things like our Facebook, our Twitter, and our Instagram. Why I kind of have the overlap on here and what's different about targeted communications is that targeted communications are for people who aren't already engaging in our content. We are targeting them because we believe that they are interested in the work that we are doing, that they will be valued, they will incur value from the work that we're producing. And that our access features are going to serve them, that we've imagined them in our space with empathy, and now we want them to come. And so these kind of things do really need to explicitly state the work that we're doing, to explicitly talk about all of the access features we have, to explicitly state who we are as an organization and what our ethos is. And that can be that way in which individuals who have experienced environmental ableism, attitudinal ableism, and organizational ableism can take that first step and being like, oh, I am imagined in this space, therefore I feel welcome, therefore I want to engage with this content. Oftentimes we as arts practitioners, artists, cultural producers, aren't entirely always aware of what forms of ableism our potential audiences have experienced. But like that definition that Sean mentioned that Talila T.L. Lewis and Justin P. Gibson offered, you don't actually have to be disabled to experience ableism. So folks could have experienced organizational ableism from an arts organization that's unconnected to our work or your work in general, and that can make them weary of engaging with arts work in Ontario again. And so when we are intentionally dismantling ableism in our targeted communication by constantly reaffirming our access practices, our empathy practices, our organizational ethos, we are kind of doing that dismantling of ableism that our potential audiences may have experienced at different times than with us. It's also, again, I noted there's a lot of overlap between these two, especially with targeted communications also being untargeted. And I kind of mentioned this because no matter how much we can build up communities on our Facebook and our Twitters and our Instagram and our newsletters, when we are producing new content, new events, new exhibitions, we do always have to reaffirm what those access and empathy and organizational ethoses are, because we don't know when people have re-engaged with our content. Well, this isn't necessarily important for like every single Facebook post that you ever do to like have a line about your access why this doesn't mean that every single Facebook post you publish needs to just say what every single access component of your organization is. It is good to note that as we are doing these untargeted communications that are about community building, when we're doing new specific events, those are the times where untargeted communications become targeted. In those times in which we've built up our community, they need to be reminded of what our access policies are, what our empathy policies are, and what our organizational ethoses are. And so how do we actually do that? How do we actually build access? And this is kind of breaking out into our first little exercise. One of the things that Sean and I really talked about when we were planning out this conversation was it's a lot to like say, oh, you should make all of these changes to your communication that make them dismantling ableism, power affirming, agency affirming. But how do you actually do that? So this section of our presentation is some tools for how you actually build access into your presentation. So the first round of this, I'm going to actually be talking about how we make PDF documents screen reader friendly. So a lot of us, again, when we gathered in person, would do things like have posters or postcards or invitations in print. And we know that those can't always be accessible to blind and low vision audiences or non-visual learners. So we would have digital components to our PDF document that can be working with screen reader technology. And now that we're all online, PDFs are becoming even more prevalent or digital PDFs are becoming even more prevalent in the way that we communicate externally our events and experiences. But for them to be imagining with empathy new audiences, they do need to be screen reader friendly. So right now on the screen, I have a screenshot of a press release that I worked on for Valentine Brown Body Farm that Sean graciously spoke about earlier on. And I designed this in InDesign. There are lots of different ways in which we can design PDFs, whether we're just doing it in Microsoft Word or programming like Canva software. But what I do is I open it up into Adobe, and then I can search for accessibility. And this brings up all of the ways in which I can make this PDF, that is my Body Farm press release, accessible. And what this does is also imagines that there are lots of different people who are going to engage with this press release. So often we think that journalists or media personnel are all going to be sighted individuals, are all going to be engaging with visual content visually. But when we bring in those practices of imagining that somebody we send our press release kit to might be blind and low vision or might engage with visual work auditorially, we're doing that work to dismantle those beliefs of ableism. So for me personally, what I like to do is, once I have all my Access tabs open, is click on something called reading order. So this is me saying, okay, I'm a visual learner. I designed this from the visual aesthetic. How do I read this in order? And what reading order does is it allows you to tag, once you click it, I'm on the left side image right now, a little pop-up window appears. And it has all of these ways in which you can tag your content for how you want your audience to, quote, read it. And you can tag things as text, you can tag things as image, you can tag things as a form or a heading. And so on this particular press kit, I had that first text, Body Farm, and then I had the big image, and I had an image description written for that, and then I had all of the information for the date and the location of the show. So I clicked on Body Farm, I made a little box around it, said click as text, and then the PDF knows that it is a text box, and it knows to read the words Body Farm. And then I clicked on the image, wrapped it up, tagged it as a figure, and then it gives me the option of adding my alt text. So now we all have some experience in writing alt text or image description, and I can just edit within the PDF what the alt text is. Again, so anyone reading this document will just automatically have that embedded. And then lastly, tagging the last set of text. So there's 3 distinct content blocks in here, each of them being tagged as either a text or an image, and the images we just embed our image description. And so then we have to make sure that, excuse me, and then we have to make sure that computers, because they are the ones doing the actual reading from visual content to auditory content, are making sure that they know how we want them to read it. Computers are lovely and wonderful and smart, but they also aren't human. And so oftentimes Adobe can make these assumptions about text reading order that are actually really not clear. So what we do is there's a little on the left-hand side, there's a little like icon that looks like a Z or a Z going through 4 pieces of paper. And you just kind of click on that, And then each page will have all of the tags that you made, the text, the image, the text, and it will link it in order. And you can kind of fiddle around with that as the order that you want. But again, like I mentioned, computers are computers, they're not human. So what we have to do is actually ensure that the computer is going to listen to our override as opposed to its assumption. So then at the very, very top, there's those 2 pages, and it says page thumbnail. And then for each page, you can do this as each page or all at once, that you are using the document structure. So regardless of whether or not your audience is reading this on their phone with screen reader technology, if they're just running it through a Google Chrome extension, or if they actually are using an integrated program like JAWS, it is always going to read the document in the structure that you have designed for it. And then, I did these in the wrong order. I apologize. We'll start with the image on the right. So the other thing that is very important to do is make sure that our documents are titled in the right way. I don't know about all of you, but I am a designer, and so I had about 15 different file names for each little thing that I think is the final document, but it ends up being new final, or new final 2, or new final. And so until we actually override on Adobe's end, it's just going to read whatever that last document is. So if we add in the little title square, oh, this is a body farm press kit, we can save that. And then when we head over into view, we can make it so that whatever screen reader technology is being used automatically only reads that title that we've embedded. So whatever your file name is doesn't actually matter, because we told the computer that we only want it to read the title. And that's really helpful, because then we're not having to go back and change file names. And for me personally, in my internal practice, I have specific ways of naming my files for my own hierarchy of content and my own way of dividing up labor. So like making the title the public document, I can keep everything the way that served me while still serving with empathy my audience. And so then we get into checking it. And I mentioned that computers are lovely and smart, but they're not humans. Humans are lovely and smart, but we're not computers. So the one really lovely thing about Adobe is that it does access checks for us. So I've been making PDF documents accessible for 4 years now, and I still have a mistake almost every time I run my content through the access checker, because it's just those little things that like, oh, I thought I tagged this image, oh, maybe I didn't. So the way we do that is just clicking on access check and making sure that every single thing is checked off, and then do start checking. And then it'll come up and it'll give you this whole big column on the left-hand side that's going to point our attention to any images that are, or any issues that are on our document. What's great about Adobe as Access software is if you know that the computer has made a mistake, you can just skip it. And that's really great to do, because sometimes, sometimes Adobe will think that you haven't tagged everything as text, even though it's tagging everything as text. It's a little annoying sometimes. Computers are computers. But what's also great is you can ask it to explain to you the issue. So if you click explain, it'll just bring you to the Adobe website that talks about exactly what you've mentioned. So on this document, the issue was I hadn't tagged my email as an email. I just wrote it out. And so Adobe was like, yo, Kristina, like, you're saying that there's some text here, and like I'm reading it as an email, but like I don't actually know that it's an email. Like, are people supposed to click this as a link, or are they just supposed to go into their own email and like type out letter by letter what you put in? So yeah, that is bringing us to activity number 1, which is going through Adobe. Actually, you know what? I'm looking at the time right now. I want us to have time for questions, so we are going to actually skip over activity 1 and envelop it into activity 2. I apologize. But activity 2 is actually doing a very similar thing, but for our social media pages. So this is the time that, I mean, you can bring out your phone if you'd like, or you can bring it out in activity 2. So we talked a lot about all these ways in which we can make PDF documents accessible. And the PDF documents are really only one way that people are engaging with our content. And I talked a lot about our social media giants, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And as we've seen, as Sean mentioned, these changes in society to have kind of like legal and logistical components for access in our society, we've actually seen the tech giants bring access into their practices. And I can assume to you, excuse me, that the folks at Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook aren't necessarily adding in the description capacities. One moment. I'm gonna just quickly move my cat. Sweetie, thank you. Oh. The Zoom life, man. It's not a Kristina presentation unless you had seen my cat's fun. I can guarantee you that Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter are not adding alt text because like they had this disability justice mindset. They're doing it because they are influenced by the laws of our time. But that doesn't mean that we as art practitioners, cultural practitioners, can't use those tools to influence or add to our justice practice, add to our empathy. So on the screen right now are 4 screenshots of how we can make our Instagram more accessible, and that is through adding art in the description. Excuse me. So even over the last week, we have seen a lot of new interface design brought out at Instagram. So this might look slightly different than our Instagram today might look slightly different than when these screenshots were taken because Instagram did do some new launches, but they didn't change the way you write alt text, which is a little bit unfortunate, and Instagram is still not listening to me when I rant about their features in the presentation. So when you go to add your new post, it will allow you to add either your image or your video or your various varieties of, or your slideshow of images. And so I'm going to assume that all of us have done that before, and we've all added our caption to our image. What is annoying about Instagram is that to add an alt text, we need to go all the way to the very bottom of that new post page and click on something that says advanced settings. That is much smaller text and a much smaller color than all the other features. And then once we're in advanced settings, we have write alt text. And then we can click that and it brings us up this little window that will allow us to add our alt text. And then it's there, it's in the back end. Anyone who is using screen reader technology, whether that is on their desktop or on their mobile, will read the image description as opposed to just seeing the image. On Instagram, there is no visual indicator that your image has alt text to anyone who isn't using screen reader technology. So we just have to assume that it's there and assume that whoever needs it can access it, which is, I won't rant about Instagram any longer. And now this is Facebook. So Facebook has also recently changed their Creator Studio. What is very important to note about Facebook is that a couple weeks ago, edit used to be where we would click edit, and one of the options was add alt text. What Facebook has done in the last few days or few weeks, I honestly don't know when they made the change, was make a whole new icon for alt text or other features that aren't necessarily, quote, editing the photo. And those are those three little dots on the upper left-hand side of the image. And when you click this, and this is a screenshot from mobile, but it looks fairly similar on desktop, it brings up a little pop-up window, and the very last option is Edit Alt Text. Facebook over the last year have been involving AI generator image descriptions into their content. Oftentimes these are fairly inaccurate, and it's really important when we are using visual images, especially on Facebook, that we do override these auto-generated image descriptions because, like I mentioned, computers aren't human. Facebook wants us to remember that alt text is only 100 characters, which sometimes can be true, but sometimes is not. And there's no technological reason why you can't go over 100 characters. Facebook just gives you a little warning sign that you have hit that. And then you hit done, and I mean, it essentially looks the exact same as image one. You hit done, and it's much like Instagram, where for anyone who is not using screen reader technology, there's no visual indication that the image has alt text, that anyone using screen reader technology will be using alt text. And then lastly, we have Twitter. So Twitter has had alt text embedded longer than Facebook and Instagram, but there's still a few kind of like kinks to work out. So when you go to add your image, there is an entire icon that just says alt, which is wonderful. So they've kind of gone the same way as Facebook and disrupting edit and alt as different things. So if you click on alt, it gives you a little pop-up window about what exactly alt text is, and a little bit about what good descriptions are. And you say sure, and you plug it in. You plug in the description that you have. On Twitter, much like their tweets themselves, there are character limits of how much you can have. And so that is 1,000 characters. That, like, I had never encountered an image description for social media longer than 1,000 characters, but it is good to note that Twitter will just cut you off if you go over that. So just a good thing to know when we are actually writing those descriptions, that they cannot go over 1,000 characters or else Twitter will just cut us off. Twitter, unlike Facebook and Instagram, it actually have a visual indicator for non-screen reader users of there being alt text, which I personally really, really like, because it becomes this visual indication that we are counteracting ableism. We are disrupting ableism in our practice by adding alt text. One other thing that I did want to mention about Twitter and how we are disrupting ableism in our tweets is the use of hashtags. So hashtags are prevalent across all platforms, but probably most prevalent on Facebook or on Twitter, And when a screen reader is reading a hashtag, if all the letters are lowercase, it just reads it out as one word. And so if you have a multi-word hashtag, it's just going to put all of those letters together, smash it together, and try to make some sounding sound out of those letters. As well, if all of your letters are capitalized in a hashtag, it will read each one of those letters individually. But computers are smart if we tell them what to do. So if you capitalize the first letter of each word in your hashtag, the screen reader knows that that is an actual word and that is a break in the word, and it will actually read out hashtag Crypt Time Podcast. You should listen to our podcast, shameless plug. And so, yeah, oh my goodness. We're already at 2 o'clock. I apologize. We're gonna actually then go into checking access and just do an activity together. Because I really do want to spend time for some questions. And then next week I will be here. So if you want to walk through how to actually add image description into each social media and how to actually make your PDF accessible step by step, I will do it. But I do kind of want to get through the content with time for Sean and I to answer your question. So there are 2 biggest ways that we can check our content digitally to make sure that it is accessible. That's a lie. There are more than 2 ways in which we can check. There are 2 ways that I refer to a lot in my practice. And one is for my desktop and one is for my mobile. So on my desktop, I'm a Chrome user, and I have installed a plugin called Totally Plugin. And I just have this on every single Chrome web page that I open. And it is just constantly reading if there are any mistakes on my website for somebody who is reading reading with a screen reader. As well, anyone who is using the tab function. So for a lot of us who use a trackpad or a mouse, we have a lot of ways in which we can operate our computer. But there are a lot of folks who, for mobility limitations or just usability desires, will only use the tab function on their computer. So they'll just hit tab, 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 tab until they get to the page they want, click enter and go to that page. So what the Totally plugin does is it reads your website and it does it as both a tab user and a screen reader user. And then it brings up any issues you may encounter. And so if you don't want to have this on all of your websites, you can turn it on and off very easily once you install it in your Chrome store. And you just, if you want to turn it on, you just click on, and on the left-hand side of the screen, it brings out all the categories that it's testing. And if you have the green arrow, it means that everything is good. And if you have a red X, it means that there's an issue. And then any issue that brings up on the right-hand side, and it tells you what those issues are, it reads out in an auditory voice how the computer is engaging with that. And for me personally, I use my trackpad. I am a visual learner, so I don't engage with screen reader. I don't engage with web content auditorially that often, but whenever I publish something on Tangled's website, I check it because I know that for me to desire audiences with community, for me to desire my community enter my spaces with empathy, I need to learn how, I need to use the website, and I mean, I use this on our Facebook and Twitter as well, use it with somebody who is using screen reader or tab functionality. The other way that I test this is on my phone. So I know that all of these social media giants are mostly accessed by our phone. As well, like I mentioned, there are a lot of folks who don't use mouses or trackpad, and actually using a phone or an iPad is a lot more accessible to them. And there, I am an iPhone user, I'm an Apple user, and I know that there are ways to do this on Android. I just don't have them on the screen, nor do I have the really confidence about speaking about them. But for us to make our content or to install screen reader or voiceover technology on our phone, for an Apple iPhone, we go into settings. And once we are in settings, we can click on accessibility. And then we can click on what is called spoken content. And on the factory settings of our phone, this will just be turned off. So the little like gray icon. But if we click on it, it turns green. And what's great about this is it's always on and always able to be accessed, but it doesn't actually do anything until you ask it to do something. So how you ask it to do something is you take 2 fingers and you swipe down, and it will just, there you go, it will just start speaking as a screen reader device. And this is, again, a great thing for us to just check our Facebook, check our Twitter, check our website. One thing that Sean and I realized when we were running through this presentation is that Instagram, I said I wouldn't rant about Instagram anymore, but here I am ranting about them again. Instagram doesn't actually engage with these back-end screen reader technologies in their app itself. So if you are wanting to check Instagram, you actually have to open it up in Safari to test it, which is infuriating, and maybe one day Instagram will listen to me and change their platform. But this is one thing that is a great way to engage with content. Also, for folks who maybe are wanting to multitask in this time of Zoom, it's just a great thing to use. But for us as cultural practitioners, arts creators, arts administrators, engaging in these technologies is a great way for us to, again, imagine our audiences and our communities in our spaces, our digital spaces, before they even arrive. And so there aren't these issues that are coming up where we unknowingly are practicing environmental, attitudinal, or organizational ableism because we are disrupting these norms by focusing on a disability aesthetic or a disability-led identity, a crypt politic. That was a little general sentence, but I think it made sense. But by using these technologies, we are actually like dismantling the ableism that we are doing. And again, don't have time for activities. I really want to make sure we have time for questions. So our resources. Like I mentioned earlier, I've been working in this kind of disability art sector for 4 years now. And I barely know close to everything about how to make things accessible. So these are things that I refer to very often. I've been talking about a lot. There are legal bounds for how to make content accessible, spurred by the ADA and the AODA, and this does go into our digital spaces. So the World Wide Web Consortium is an incredible resource for legal standards and strategies to supporting making your website accessible. Like Sean mentioned, the AODA has been in effect for many years now, but there's really no kind of like enforcement for that. So all websites actually under AODA and under the ADA are supposed to be accessible. And the World Wide Web Consortium has all the rules, or all the tools on how to conform to these rules. And there isn't really ramifications on a legal standpoint if your website is inaccessible. But again, making it accessible is these community building through empathy and desire. The World Wide Web Consortium actually has an entire section on evaluation. So it goes above and beyond the Totally plugin that I spoke about that I'm very comfortable with. WebAIM is an incredible resource similar to the World Wide Web Consortium, but it kind of also talks about digital product creation that isn't necessarily a website itself. I personally love using WebAIM as a way to check my contrast. So for folks who are auditory learners that are blind, or excuse me, who are auditory learners but are low vision, there are certain ways in which we can design our content to have high enough contrast between our text and our background. And the WebAIM is just a great tool for me to check that. Because I can, as a sighted individual, I can kind of guess when things are accessible, but WebAIM is a really great tool for me to just make sure that I'm not assuming anything with my privilege of being a sighted individual. And then we have Accessify. And this is just, it is much like the Totally plugin, but it does the, excuse me, Accessify is much like Totally, but it's not necessarily always there. You just access it when you need it, and it will run a free test and give you all of these tools on how to make it more accessible. So it's not necessarily something that you're going to be doing every single day, but if you are launching a new section on your website, or if you made some big update, it's a great way to just like, you know what, I want to test this above and beyond my Totally plugin, or above and beyond what my Apple iPhone can provide. And then we have pauljadams.com, and this is just a big collection of web testing tools, and this is a Safari extension. So like I mentioned, I use Chrome. That's what I'm most comfortable in, that I know that not everyone does. So Paul J. Adams is for Safari users and non-Chrome users. And then we have Sally, so playing off of the Ally. And it was made by Ryerson students, or Ryerson staff, or something to do with Ryerson as an organization. So this really looks at content authors. So that would be us in the group who are actually on the back end of our personal website or our organizational website. So yeah, this is geared towards like content creators or content authors. So those of us who are like in the back end of our website actually like plugging in, this gives us resources on how to do it, so that when we run those tests, we encounter even less issues. So yeah, then it is the Ally project, which is just like a very comprehensive collection of software, but also books and blogs that really enhance our process. The Totally plugin, a great resource. I love it very much. And then another one that it's, I should know how to pronounce this if I didn't get the presentation. The Percolese text-to-speech reader. This is also available in the Chrome store. Unlike Totally, it doesn't necessarily indicate any issue, but it will just read everything for you. And so I personally prefer my phone to Percolese, but I know not everyone's on their phone every day, but it is kind of the same thing, and it operates like the Totally plugin, where you just have it on your computer at all times and just click it on and off if you're wanting to look into it. And then another resource that I really like is actually the Harvard Digital Accessibility Services. These large institutions that have a lot of money do have a lot of resources to create these accessibility services. And much like the large tech giants that I mentioned, they're not doing this through like a super socially justice-minded lens, but they do have all of these technical requirements that they're reaching to lean into the legislative requirements of the ADA for America specifically. And these are like targeted specifically for like Harvard content, but I found that like if you just go through that website, the Harvard website, the tools are pretty across the board on how to actually make your content more accessible, because Harvard does really have high accessibility standards. So this gets me to my recap of my presentation. Again, I apologize for us not having time to actually do those activities, but we can go through the questions next. And I will be here next week for anyone who wants to go through step by step. To recap of mine and Sean's presentation, dismantling ableism is hard work. I know we just talked at you for literally 2.5 hours, almost 3 hours, and all of these ways in which art practices in Ontario, arts work, digital spaces can help us dismantle ableism. And I say dismantling ableism is hard work, and I say this intentionally because oftentimes in society, in our conversation, we hear that making things accessible is hard work. And I really, really disagree with that sentence and that sentiment. the labor isn't actually making things accessible. That's just the practice that we're doing to dismantle ableism. That we as artists, art practitioners, cultural workers, the labor is actually found in the dismantling of the environmental, attitudinal, and organizational ableism that has been so pervasive in our society. And we have all these tools and how to do it, and so often they're framed as make your content accessible. That's not really what it is. Making the content accessible is the reward for the work of dismantling ableism.